Before dawn, on a road that cuts through the dark spine of the Scottish Highlands, a convoy moves without headlights. Inside climate-controlled crates, 12 Eurasian beavers sit in silence. They have been quarantined, health screened, and genetically cataloged. They do not know any of this. They know only the vibration of the road beneath them, the smell of pine resin bleeding through ventilation slats, and somewhere ahead, the sound of water. The crates stop at the edge of a Highland loch. The water is black and still. The banks are bare. No dam has stood here in over 400 years. The first latch opens. A single beaver drops into the shallows, slaps the surface once with a broad, flat tail, and vanishes beneath the dark water without a ripple. In 18 months, what these 12 animals build in this dead loch will stun every hydrologist who runs the numbers. It will slash peak flood flows by 60%. It will quadruple an endangered mammal population that was teetering on regional collapse. It will produce an 80% spike in aquatic biodiversity, so dramatic that scientists will check their instruments twice before publishing. But right now, in the dark, there are just 12 animals, a dead loch, and 4 centuries of silence about to be broken. Walk the banks of this loch before the beavers arrive, and it looks like wilderness. Heather crawls across the upper slopes. Scots pine crowd the ridgeline. The water catches the thin Highland light and throws it back, silver and clean. But clean is not the same as alive. The loch's water runs fast and unimpeded, racing downhill the way water moves through a system with nothing left to slow it. No wetland fringe, no emergent reed beds, no structural complexity at the margins. No standing deadwood rotting at the water's edge, feeding the fungi and beetles that feed everything above them. The food web here has collapsed into its simplest possible form. Water enters. Water exits. Nothing accumulates. Nothing transforms. This is what 4 centuries of absence does to a river system. The Eurasian beaver did not disappear from Scotland through misfortune. It was removed, methodically and completely, across 3 centuries of targeted hunting. Beaver fur lined the coats of European nobility. Castoreum, a secretion from the beaver's scent glands, was harvested for use in medicine and perfume and paid for at a price that made every animal on a Scottish riverbank worth killing. When the fur trade thinned the population to its final remnant, landowners and drainage managers finished the work, trapping the last survivors out of channels they considered better managed without them. By the 16th century, Scotland held no beavers. The loch sat for 400 years in a silence it had not chosen. The dams decayed. The ponds drained. The wetland margins dried and simplified. The water vole population that had sheltered in the tangled beaver-built banks lost its habitat and began its own quiet collapse. Macroinvertebrates that had colonized submerged logs and fine beaver-deposited sediments lost their substrate and vanished from survey records. Floodwaters that beaver ponds had once held and released slowly now peaked hard and fast, battering downstream channels with the unchecked violence of an unmanaged catchment. The loch looked like Scotland. It no longer functioned like one. Then the crates open, and 12 animals armed with nothing but teeth, mud, and 400 million years of mammalian instinct get to work. The first thing they build is the dam. A beaver selects a willow stem with its incisors, working around the base in precise circular cuts, the wood peeling away in pale curling strips that fall into the shallows. The felled stem is not abandoned. It is gripped at the thickest point and dragged, sometimes upstream, always deliberately, to a channel narrows where the current slows and the banks pinch close enough to anchor a structure. More stems follow, then branches, then handfuls of mud scooped from the bank and packed into the gaps between the wood with the beaver's forepaws. each load tamped and pressed until the structure holds water behind it. The pond begins to fill. Within weeks, the first dam arches across a narrow tributary. Within months, a network of interconnected structures backs water across meadows that have not flooded since the medieval period. The Loch's hydrology has been rewritten by animals that have never read a single engineering specification. The second thing the dams do is stop the floods. Before the Beavers, every major storm event sends a pulse of water racing off the catchment and into the channel below, peaking fast, cresting hard, and dumping its full force on whatever lies downstream. After 12 animals spend 18 months packing mud into gaps and adjusting their structures night after night, the data that flows out of the monitoring gauges is almost impossible to believe. Peak flood flows through the catchment drop by 60%. Not nudged downward, not modestly reduced. 60%. The difference between a river that breaks its banks and a landscape that quietly drinks the storm. And beyond the peak reduction, the timing of flood events shifts fundamentally. Water that once peaked within an hour of a major rain event now takes 2.5 to 3 hours to reach its maximum downstream. That is 2.5 to 3 hours of warning. 2.5 to 3 hours of breathing room for every town, farm, and road sitting in the flood shadow below. When scientists validate these figures against in-stream gauges across multiple catchments, the error margin between their models and field reality sits at less than 8%. The numbers are not anomalies. They replicate. Winter after winter, storm after storm, the Beaver dams absorb, delay, and soften what the sky sends down. The third thing the ponds create is habitat. The backed-up water floods the lowest margins of the Loch's banks, killing the base of trees standing in the new shallows and producing standing deadwood called snags that would take decades to develop through natural decay. Reed beds colonize the soft new margins within a single growing season. Mud banks exposed by fluctuating water levels become bare earth, critical open ground for specialist invertebrates that cannot establish in the dense vegetation covering every other centimeter of the catchment. The water vole, a species that had been declining steadily across the Loch's catchment for years, finds in those tangled, reed-fringed, beaver-built banks everything it needs: food, cover, and refuge from predators. Within a decade of the release, the water vole monitoring index quadruples, from just over 1 capture per 100 trap nights to more than 5. A species that had been quietly tipping toward regional collapse now holds ground. It has not occupied in living memory. Macroinvertebrate richness in the beaver-influenced streams jumps by nearly 80% as submerged logs, fine sediment deposits, and the complex hydraulic mosaic of the dam network create dozens of new microhabitats where there were previously none. Otters move into the slow, fish-rich water behind the structures. Amphibians breed in the shallow margins. Reed buntings stake out territories in vegetation that did not exist 18 months earlier. The fourth thing the dams do is clean the water. Fine sediment moving downstream from agricultural land above the catchment slows behind the dam cores and drops out of suspension. The turbidity sensors installed downstream of active beaver sites record a 15% reduction in suspended particles. Nutrient traps embedded in the dam structures capture agricultural runoff at a rate that cuts nitrate concentrations by 12% and phosphate concentrations by 8%. Monthly water chemistry assays run by field technicians show rising dissolved oxygen, lower acidity, and a measurable reduction in the agricultural pollutants that had been degrading spawning habitat for years. 12 animals using mud and sticks have done what decades of riparian buffer planting and drainage management could not. They have turned a degraded Highland loch into a living water filter. But the beavers do not read property lines. A dam appears overnight in a drainage channel that a hill farmer has maintained for 30 years. The field above it, reliably dry by early spring in a normal year, now holds standing water through April. Livestock are displaced. A hay crop drowns before it can be cut. The anger is real and it is legitimate. This is not a cartoon conflict between progress and reaction. This is a working farmer watching a system he depends on change without his consent, altered overnight by an animal he had no vote in reintroducing. Every emergency intervention carries a cost. When a freshly constructed beaver dam blocks a purpose-built fish pass on a salmon river, a management crew deploys within days. That includes labor, equipment, and travel. The mean cost per incident, once the figures are tallied across the catchment, settles at £1,180. Manageable for a national conservation body in a single season. The costs compound quickly as the population expands. The management response evolves. Brute force removal gives way to dam notching, a surgical technique in which a field crew cuts a narrow 30-centimeter gap through the structure, restoring water flow and fish passage while leaving the beaver's engineering mostly intact. On one Highland river, 94% of tagged salmon smolts navigate notched dams successfully on their downstream migration. The notching crews work fast. A dam that took a beaver family a week to build can be notched in a single morning. Where conflict persists, relocation becomes the alternative to lethal control. In 1 year alone, 79 beavers are trapped and moved to new catchments, reducing local incidents by 2/3. The number of licensed lethal removals across Scotland drops from 87 in a single peak year to just 23 in the most recent count. The management system is not perfect. It is adaptive. Each blocked culvert and flooded field is a negotiation between the needs of a species that does not compromise and the demands of a landscape that cannot simply be rewilded without consequence. 12 beavers slipped into a dead Highland loch. In 18 months, they built a dam network that cut peak flood flows by 60%, quadrupled the water vole index, drove a near 80% rise in aquatic biodiversity, and turned degraded water into something clean enough to support the salmon runs. Their own dams were simultaneously blocking. This was a miracle. The contradiction is the story. The miracle and the friction are the same animal, doing what it has always done in a landscape that has spent 4 centuries forgetting what that looks like. Scotland now holds over 2,000 beavers. Projections from the most recent National Management Report suggest that number could reach 10,000 by the end of this decade. 6 major catchments already show measurable signs of beaver-driven hydrological change. The experiment that began with 12 crates on a Highland road is no longer an experiment. It is a population. It is a policy challenge. It is a flood management strategy that no government agency planned for, and no infrastructure budget could have funded. And somewhere in the reed beds of a loch that was dead 18 months ago, a water vole is building a burrow in a bank that a beaver built, beside a pond that did not exist, in a landscape that is, for the first time in 4 centuries, remembering what it was supposed to be. But beavers are not the most controversial animal being returned to Britain's broken landscapes. In our next video, we go to a place where a much larger and far more disputed species has been released into a forest that has spent thousands of years forgetting it. Apex predator. An animal that farmers, scientists, and governments have fought over for decades. An animal whose return does not just reshape a river system, but rewrites an entire food web from the top down. What happens when the thing at the top of the chain walks back in? You will not look at rewilding the same way again.